husband or a wife or a brother or sister or a parent, but somebody who you trust. Somebody who trusts you. Do you have someone in mind? Do you have someone important in mind, somebody you trust? Now close your eyes. Picture that person. Think of their face. Think of how they look. You have it? Now hold that picture. Think about how they look. And then imagine what their expression would be if you plunged a knife into their heart. Imagine their expression if they had fallen off a cliff and you had managed to grab them, but then you let them go. Imagine their expression if the last thing they saw before they died was you, and they knew that you let it happen. Welcome to my world. My name is Peter. That's not the name my father gave me. He called me Simon. We lived in Capernaum on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. We worked out of Bethsaida, which is a small fishing village just outside of town. And Father taught me an honorable trade. He taught me to be a fisherman. It's tough work, but it's honest work. I grew up with a net in my hand. And we did well enough in spite of the taxes. We made a good living. By the time I was 25, I had my own boat. Well, actually, it had been my father's boat that he willed to me. But it had been refitted and repaired. You know, wood is not always easy to come by, and it can be expensive to fix a boat. We did it. We kept it floating. We kept it working. And we owned it, my brother Andrew and I. We owned it and we worked it. And we were successful fishermen. And then one day Andrew got it in his head to take off and follow after some wild-eyed preacher he heard about named John. So he went down to Judea and he spent his time following him around, listening to him rave and watching him dunk people in the river. But I kept his name on the books anyway, so he's part owner of the boat. You know, he's family, even if he is crazy. And one day, probably a year or two after he left, Andrew came back. He came back and he had this wild story about still another prophet. This one was from Galilee. This one was a guy named Jesus. And Andrew had begun following him after he encountered John the Baptist, and John had said, "Follow that guy." So he just went on and on about him and told me he was the real deal. This was somebody special. This was a holy man. And I listened as much as I could, and I rolled my eyes and I said, "Yeah, whatever." He went off on these binges sometimes where he just couldn't stop talking. I couldn't get him to shut up for the life of me. And then one day he actually brought Jesus to me. It wasn't my idea, it was Andrew's idea. I suppose it was Jesus' idea. But he brought him to meet me, and he sat down and we talked while I worked. I was repairing nets. And Jesus seemed pleasant enough for a lunatic. He asked me questions about fishing and about the business, and I answered as little as possible. I really didn't want to engage him. But he kept talking. He told me about his life growing up, how he learned to be a carpenter from his father. And he would just keep asking me questions. And I realized as we went on that he had this look in his eyes. He wasn't just making small talk. You could see in his eyes that he was focused entirely on me at that point. So I actually meant something. That time that we sat there, he was fully engaged in what I was saying, even as I was trying not to say anything. I had a feeling he understood that too. And that's why it kind of took me by surprise when after we had talked for a while and I was kind of finishing up and trying to figure out how I could gracefully leave him. He looked at me and said, "You know, if you follow me the way your brother did, I could make you a fisher of men." Isn't that just the stupidest thing you ever heard? That's how it struck me. I mean, fisher of men. Stupidest thing I ever heard. And then it turned out it was the second stupidest thing, because the first stupidest thing was me saying yes. I followed him. I said yes. I left my younger brothers in charge of the boat. I kissed my wife and my kids goodbye, and I packed a couple of things I thought I would need, and I set out to follow Jesus wherever it was he went. I followed him for 3 years. 3 years of going from town to town. I never knew where we were going to end up. Early on, I never knew what we were going to eat, but I figured out pretty early that Jesus had a way of figuring that out for us. We never went hungry. But for 3 years, I listened to him teach. And I listened to him preach, and I learned more than I had in my entire life before that. And they were the hardest years of my life, I think. I missed my family. I missed having a place that I could call home. But I kept on. And as I kept on, and as Jesus kept on, his following grew. There were people that literally followed him from place to place because they just wanted to get all they could from him. And there were many others who spread the word so that as he came into a new town, they would already know about him. They would be anxious to come and see. Watch him do some signs and wonders, maybe heal somebody. Maybe do a couple of little miracles. Listen to him teach. Listen to him bring hope to a people that just didn't have any. And the other disciples and I, we struggled to understand what he was telling us, what he meant. It started out early on with pretty simple teachings, things that we could understand pretty easily, things we had heard before in synagogue but maybe had not thought of in quite the same way. And then once we were familiar with what he was teaching, once we were at ease, he moved a little farther away. It was as though we were being led into the Sea of Galilee, and once we were comfortable being waist deep in it, he would move out until we were up to our shoulders, and then until we were up to our neck, and eventually we were treading water, trying to keep up with him. Trying to understand what it was he was trying to teach us. And as we struggled, it became more and more obvious to us that this man, as Andrew had told me, this man was the real deal. He was the Messiah. The one we'd all been waiting for. At least we were pretty sure. And as he taught us, it became more and more obvious. And then one day he came right out and he asked us who we thought he was, and I was the first one to speak. And I said, Jesus, you're the Messiah we've been waiting for. And he just smiled at me. Smiled at me, a little twinkle in his eyes. And he called me Kepha. Aramaic means the rock. Petros in Greek, Petros in Latin. You might know it as Peter. He called me the rock before, but usually it was when he was pointing at his head, or at my head. Because I wasn't getting something he was trying to tell me. But this was the first time he really said it as a compliment. This time he said it, and I knew that he meant I would be a foundation for his church. I would be one of the ones that he could depend upon to help spread his teaching. I was amazed and frightened and glad all at the same time. And then he continued to teach, and as he taught, it grew darker. He started talking more about dying, about having to die, just to fulfill his obligation here on earth, to fulfill what he had been sent to do. And it was a recurring theme with him, and it got to be really depressing for us. And at the Last Supper, the supper we had before Passover, he was talking about it again. He was talking about being betrayed and about being abandoned. And when we said, no, Lord, we would never abandon you. I think after 3 years we're going to abandon you suddenly, and he just smiled kind of sadly and nodded. And when I protested, he just looked at me and said, okay, Father, you too. You'll deny me 3 times before morning. We tried to get him out of his funk. We reminded him of the triumphal entry that he had into Jerusalem just a few days before. He wouldn't have any of that. He just looked really, really, really sad and really scared. And eventually we left and we went outside the city so that he could be alone to pray. And that's when he got arrested. Some of us fought. When they came to get him, some of us fought briefly, for a moment, and then we scattered. We ran like little children. We left him on his own to face the authorities. And they dragged him off. And it was only some hours later that I got up the courage to try to go see him. And I went with another disciple who knew one of the priests and was able to get us into the area of the city where the priest lived. He was able to get me into the private compound of the high priest, which is where we knew he would be. And I honestly don't know why I went. I think I was just hoping to see that he was still alive, to kind of reassure myself that it wasn't all lost yet. Maybe I had some fantasy about setting him free. I'm not quite sure. But I knew it was very important that I see him, and so I went. Got up as much courage as I could, and I went, and I stood out in the yard and warmed myself by the brazier that Some of the other guards and the others were huddled around. It was a cold night. And as I stood there, servants of the priest kept coming up to me and looking at me in the torchlight and saying, "Well, you're one of his disciples. We saw you at the temple. You're one of his disciples, aren't you? We saw him with you in the street." And every time they said that, I immediately said, no, you've got me mistaken for somebody else. I don't know this Jesus character you're talking about. 3 times I was asked, and 3 times I said no. 3 times I denied even knowing Jesus. And then there was a commotion at the gate to the inner house. And a small knot of guards moved through, kind of pushing their way through the yard. I could see that they were leading Jesus through the courtyard and they were going out the gate. And the way they were going, I knew that they were headed to the Fortress Antonia, which is where the Roman procurator had residence. The only reason they could be going there was so that he could pronounce a death sentence. I remember looking. I remember seeing his face, and it was already battered. It was bloody. It was starting to swell. His eyes were still open, and they were still clear, and they looked right at me. In the gloom. We made eye contact there. And I could see that in his eyes there was fear and there was the utter aloneness, being abandoned. I don't know what I could have done. I don't know what I could have done just by acknowledging him. I don't know what would have been accomplished if I'd had the courage to say, "Yes, you're right, I know him. He's my teacher. He's my friend, I love him." All I do know is that I'll never have the chance to find out. And I know what he taught, what he preached about. I know what he said. But I can't help but believe that last glimpse in the courtyard as he was being hauled away was the last time that I would see his face. And I would never see him again. Everything else he had taught me, everything else I had believed was gone. Just vanished in a cloud of fear. And I stood there and I watched him be led away. Too scared to even make eye contact with anyone else. I know I'm not going to see him again. I pray that I'm wrong. And if by some lucky chance I am wrong, I do know one thing. I will never betray him again. Amen.